The original Diablo is a game that's affected many people's lives, to the point that if you were to go around and ask what were some of the original games that had an impact on an entire genre, Diablo would probably be mentioned more than once. And it wouldn't be surprising either, because few games have had as much influence on a genre as Diablo has with action RPGs. While many feel the game is a masterpiece, in this video, we'll be asking the question, why is Diablo a masterpiece while its expansion Hellfire is usually not considered to be the same quality? To answer this, we'll need to look at some of the behind-the-scenes issues that arose before and during Hellfire's development. Before going into that, however, we do first need to dive into Diablo itself. To start, that means we travel back in time to the mid-90s and take a look at how Diablo began. It was developed by a company called Condor Studios at the time, which had 3 founders. In an interview, one of the founders, David Brevik, explains that RPGs were a really difficult product to market at the time to publishers because they thought it was a dying genre. It just so happened that also at the time, people in Blizzard Entertainment had completed Warcraft 2. They were looking to expand their catalog of games outside of the RTS genre. After seeing the quality of Diablo, people in Blizzard not only agreed to publish the game, but purchased the company Condor and renamed it to Blizzard North, as they knew if they didn't buy the studio, someone else probably would. The especially important note here that comes into play later with Hellfire is the company was now officially under the umbrella of Blizzard. During my research for this, I came across an absolute gem of a video of Blizzard showcasing Diablo in 1996.
Okay, now you're the guys who did Warcraft, right? So
Yes.
you've got a little bit of a reputation out there for doing good stuff. Let's take a look at Diablo and just what's the story here, Max?
Okay, you start out with a character. You can pick either a warrior, a rogue, or a sorcerer. I've got the warrior queued up here.
Okay,
And
so that's me in the middle of the screen.
That's you in the middle of the screen. We've made the interface.
This is amazing because you can see how vastly different the bottom of the screen is with the menu options compared to the modern version of Diablo that we now have. Even the dialogue changed at the last minute, as we see with the dying townsperson outside of the monastery, which we will learn how it changed exactly when we get into the story a bit later. The game was released to stores in 1997, and as many people know now, it was a massive success. In many ways, the quality of a product begins when you first see it, and that standard is already set high when you look at the box. The front has the iconic face of Diablo, and if you open the front flap, it's bright and vivid, and we see multiple screenshots that display the multiplayer aspect in all of its glory. The back is no less beautiful because when we see a combination of a couple of screenshots of gameplay along with the impressive cinematics, it shows some of what is in store for us. If you had purchased the box back then and were curious about the lore of the Diablo universe, searching online was definitely not as easy as it is now, so the first place you'd be likely to look is in the game manual. And I do have to say that this manual is both incredible and beautiful, and I have so many iconic memories with it for me personally. It's filled with so much artwork and it describes the lore of all of the classes. Even the borders of some of the pages are themed and give incredible attention to detail. Beyond that, there's also pages that describe and show pictures of all of the armor and the weapons and how they look inside of the game. The descriptions themselves even occasionally contain bits of lore, such as the bow, where it states the greatest archers in the world are the Sisters of the Sightless Eye. Moving to the spells and magic section is no less impressive when you're met with a page that looks like this. In fact, almost every page contains not only bits and pieces of lore, but wonderful artwork, as you can probably tell as I'm going through this. And as you might expect also, this continues when going through the bestiary and the descriptions of all of these undead and demons that you will be facing. If you want to make an impression on someone after they've purchased a game, this is how you do it. This brings us to the lore in the manual, and it is both epic in scope and extends far beyond anything that we see inside of the game, showing the creators had an amazing amount of lore planned out from the very beginning. The Archangel Tyrael appears here for the first time in this manual. Both Mephisto and Baal are already mentioned here as well, along with the character we don't see until Diablo 3, Asmodan is already here in 1997 along with all of the other lesser evils. We also learn about the Order of the Herodrum that was created to combat and contain evil in the mortal realm. The next portion of lore appears inside the game world, so how about we let the exceptional voice acting explain this part?
There is a war that rages on even now, beyond the fields that we know, between the utopian kingdoms of the high heavens and the chaotic pits of the burning hells. This war is known as the Great Conflict, and it has raged and burned longer than any of the stars in the sky. Neither side ever gains sway for long, as the forces of light and darkness constantly vie for control over all creation.
Going back to the manual, it wasn't until humans first appeared in the mortal realm that fighting initially stopped. Both factions waiting to see which side humans would choose. Eventually, both light and dark would try and persuade humans to their respective sides. We also learned the reason everything is happening in a small town named Tristram is because Diablo was imprisoned here by the ancient order of the Herodrum. Diablo's essence was hidden in a deep cave, and a monastery was then built to safeguard this evil from the world. Pretty incredible lead up to the events of the game. And the beauty of all of this is you don't have to read the manual to know exactly what's going on in the world. It provides additional backstory, but the developers and the writers use the world of the game to tell us what's happening now. That begins when we watch the opening cinematic. The tone here is being set that we are going to experience an overall darker setting. The developers want us to know that this is not a normal fantasy game of elves and dwarves against orcs, nor does it feel like a typical story of good versus evil. From this, it seems like evil's already won, and all we're doing is arriving after demons have invaded, and it may be too late. Of course, the cinematic ends with Diablo to show us exactly who we are going to eventually face. When we begin a new game, the first thing you notice in the town of Tristram is the exceptional atmosphere of this world. Immediately, it feels like an isolated medieval town. There's a dark, gothic, and gloomy look to all the buildings, and the only sources of light seem to come from inside the houses. There are trees all around the town, and they look like they might be dying. We aren't told the time of year that this is, though, so is it winter and they are in hibernation? Or is it all from the events that's happening in the game? We don't quite know, but it adds a layer of mystery and depth to this world. If we move to the old monastery, there's glowing red lights emanating from the windows that even cast some light on the ground, beautiful and foreboding all at the same time. Of course, the atmosphere doesn't end there because the dungeon that we'll be exploring contains 16 levels, and the environment and look continue to change and evolve as we delve ever deeper into the earth. This is a subtle but clever way the developers show storytelling to us through art direction. We aren't just going deeper underground in a monastery, but it feels like we're traveling through time and maybe even other realms. For example, after the well-constructed halls of the first few levels, we travel through rough stonework potentially when the monastery was first created. From there, we find caves that are filled with lakes and rivers of lava, and ultimately getting closer and closer to a kind of hell that's manifested deep underground. I don't actually believe it's possible to talk about the atmosphere of Diablo without commenting on the legendary music. Especially the music of Tristram, it adds to the town feeling like it's on the edge, hanging on barely by a thread. For some reason, this is encapsulated wonderfully to me in the echoing note of a flute that you hear in the background. The dungeon in the game also has music that gives an eerie and uneasy feeling while you're listening to it in the background. When you're exploring, sometimes you may not be sure whether there's monsters in the distance or is it only the music. Why don't we move on to more of the story, because if we speak to the townsfolk, we discover that there are black riders that attacked Tristram and killed many of the people that tried to stop them. We also learn that people in the surrounding countryside don't seem to be any safer because there's reports of multiple deaths and murders that are outside of the town. The main thing to note is if it came to you, why do the people of Tristram even stay here in the first place? Well, it's because it seems like they can't leave even if they wanted to. But at this point, why don't we go and speak to one of the most iconic and well-voiced characters in all of the Diablo franchise, Deckard Cain.
Hello, my friend. Stay a while and listen.
I love this character for so many reasons. Not only is he full of wisdom and guidance, informing us of a variety of story throughout the game, but one of the main reasons everybody probably remembers him is you speak to this character more than anyone else in the game. He is the easiest and quickest way to identify rare items in order to discover their hidden attributes. And as many times as you'll hear,
Hello, my friend. Stay a while and listen.
It never gets old because of the excellent voice acting and the endearing nature of the words. Everything people say in the town points us to one location, the Old Town Monastery. When we get there, we find a dying townsperson and they explain they were led by a character called Lazarus to attack the demons within. But it ended up being a trap and they were ambushed by a demon named the Butcher. It's now up to us to find any possible survivors and defeat this creature called the Butcher. All of this is an amazing way to show the atmosphere of a game world when there hasn't even been any action or combat yet. So to that, I praise the developers so highly for what they've already done. Making our way inside of the monastery, now is a good time to comment on Diablo's original 3 classes. So I initially chose the warrior in this playthrough as it's the tanky class and needs to get in the enemy's face, but I always used to play as the warrior back in the day, so I wanted to try something different this time. Before recording, I tried to go as the rogue, and it is a powerful ranged class that I had a good time with, and it excels with bows, and it can use a little bit of magic too. While its ranged attack is incredibly convenient since you don't have to chase down enemies like the warrior, I sure hope that if you try this class, you love seeing arrows and hearing the sound of them too, because you'll be listening to it thousands and thousands of times. So because of that, I am a little bit arrowed out, which leaves the mage. Unlike the more modern Diablo games, you don't learn magic by leveling up. Instead, you have to go about finding books in the dungeon or buy them from Adria, the witch in the town of Tristram. Throughout this video, you will see a good range of spells being used in the background, and then towards the end of the game, the mage becomes seemingly invincible with a combination of a few different spells like Mana Shield and then also Chain Lightning, among others. You can also easily teleport around, which is incredible and makes things very quick, so it is a fun choice. Just be sure to not get surrounded, otherwise you will have a rough time. If we now also take a brief look at some of the systems within Diablo, it's a fascinating mixture of modern ARPGs with its active combat and old school RPGs where you need to consider things like your chance to hit with classes that use physical weapons. Every time you level up, you also receive 5 attribute points that you must split between typical RPG character stats, things like strength, magic, vitality, etc. It also should be mentioned there's the random nature of the level design and the layout that changes every time you start a new game. The same is true for items that drop. Sometimes you find great things that have some benefits to them, and other times you don't. You know, something else I really enjoy about Diablo, and it's worth a mention, is the way the game handles finding its rare items. When one drops, you don't see a special flash or any kind of glow, and you don't hear a ping sound. It's just like any other item of its kind. It's hard to describe what it is exactly, but I think it's because it's so simple and it's not trying to get your attention too hard. It's also worth mentioning that these rare items They actually are rare, and you may not even find a single one in an entire playthrough outside of some of the ones you receive from a quest. So given that, it makes them extremely significant when you do eventually find one. Looking at another system that anyone who's played Diablo will be well aware of is the lack of inventory space and how easily it fills up. This is made all the more challenging by having a cap of 5,000 gold per stack that you can carry per inventory space. That being said, everything in a single-player game will remain on the ground with you throughout the entire playthrough, so at least for me, I end up having certain areas of town designated as my outdoor stash for weapons, armor with any good statistics or resistances on them, and towards the end of the game, gold is incredibly easy to come by, so there's plenty of stacks that you can see on the ground of that too. Let's move on to some of the quests, because when we make our way down and encounter the Butcher, I'm not joking in that their now famous line used to scare me as a kid.
Fresh meat.
Mainly, I think, because it feels as though you can't get away from the Butcher with how fast that it runs, and I believe this may be one of the hardest bosses in the game, given the lack of equipment that you have at this point. I died time and time again on this playthrough especially until I went around the level and had an incredibly lucky find, a staff that can cast Firewall. Finally, I opened the door and repeatedly used the spell to maximum effect and finally downed the creature. You know, the interesting thing is though, you may not face the Butcher in every single playthrough that you try. Part of Diablo's charm is the fact that each time a new game is loaded, the game randomizes a number of quests while others will always be there. The strategy guide for the game does a wonderful job breaking this down, showing that quests are separated into specific groupings. The game randomly chooses the quests from that group, and those are the ones that you'll encounter during that playthrough. This definitely helps keep the game fresh. However, not every quest is created equally, and some have much more depth to them and a far greater impact to the lore of the world than others do. As an example of this, in one of the possible quests that you might come across, we need to cleanse Tristram's water supply. We must travel to an underground spring and defeat the demons there. Afterwards, we learn the water was tainted by the mere presence of those demons. It is interesting because it shows the power of demonic corruption in the world, but there isn't a lot of lead up to it, and it's not expanded upon or followed up with by having another quest that directly ties back to it afterwards. If you compare to this, on the other hand, you might get one of the most epic quest lines that I think I've ever experienced in a game, and it is the Curse of King Leoric. It is no exaggeration to say it's both epic and stands out even today as an exceptional quest line and how you can try and go about this in a game. The origins of this take us back to the manual. Leoric was a northern lord and deeply religious. He sought to spread the teachings of an order of light. He traveled with his son Albrecht, his primary advisor Lazarus, and the captain and champion of the Order of Light, Lochdonnen, along with many other knights and priests. Coming across Tristram in the old monastery, Leoric declared that this would be the seat of power in his new kingdom. Unfortunately, the evil of Diablo still dwelt here, and over time, Diablo tried to possess the king. For many months, King Leoric fought the evil presence that continued to twist his thoughts and emotions. As this continued, madness began to seep into the king's mind, and he believed everyone around him was a betrayer to the way of the light. Even while in this maddened state, Diablo found there was still some will left inside of Leoric, so the Lord of Terror gave up on his attempt at trying to possess him. But for the king's mind, it was too late. Only corruption and madness remained behind. Am I reading this from a famous novel? No, it's crazy. This is from a video game manual from 1997. This is incredible. All of this comes together and provides context, though, for the first thing that we hear in the game world about Leoric as we begin the quest that's tied to him.
Some months ago, King Leoric's son, Prince Albrecht, was kidnapped. The king went into a rage and scoured the village for his missing child. With each passing day, Leoric seemed to slip deeper into madness. The king's knights and priests tried to placate him, But he turned against them, and sadly, they were forced to kill him. With his dying breath, the king called down a terrible curse upon his former followers. He vowed that they would serve him in darkness forever. Our former king has risen from his eternal sleep and now commands a legion of undead minions within the labyrinth. His body was buried in a tomb 3 levels beneath the cathedral. Please, good master, put his soul at ease by destroying his now cursed form.
We now make our way into the king's tomb, and considering that we learned he's building an army of undead, this next line fits perfectly.
The warmth of life has entered my tomb. Prepare yourself, mortal, to serve my master for eternity.
Once the fight begins, Leoric, now called the Skeleton King, which we know when we hover the mouse over him, continues to actively summon both skeleton warriors and archers throughout the entire battle. This is wonderfully fitting compared to what we just learned with the lore. Also, this is one of the most challenging battles in the game outside of the Butcher because we're so early on in the game, we're only on dungeon level 3 and we barely have anything to be able to handle this. When we do eventually defeat the Skeleton King, we get the following line.
Rest well, Leoric. I'll find your son.
I love that line, and I think it's because it's done so sincerely. They don't have a character say something like a joke or anything about defeating evil. Instead, even though we know all that this person had done after their mind went mad, the main character still pays them respect. I really appreciate that they ended up going with that direction. As we keep moving deeper into the dungeon, we come across a quest that appears in every single playthrough of the game, and it's called the Chamber of Bone. It is activated by this book on a pedestal.
Beyond the Hall of Heroes lies the Chamber of Bone. Eternal death awaits any who would seek to steal the treasure secured within this room. So speaks the Lord of Terror, and so it is written.
If we go back and travel to the town, we get some additional information about this quest. Adria is straight to the point if we ask her about it.
You will become an eternal servant of the Dark Lords should you perish within this cursed domain. Enter the Chamber of Bone at your own peril.
But as usual, if we go see Deckard Cain, we receive a bit more detail.
A book that speaks of a chamber of human bones? Well, a chamber of bone is mentioned in certain archaic writings that I studied in the libraries of the East. These tomes inferred that when the lords of the underworld desired to protect great treasures, they would create domains where those who died in the attempt to steal that treasure would be forever bound to defend it.
It's amazing to hear this kind of backstory that speaks about writings in the East, because it's not explored further until Diablo 2, but for now, it's only adding a distinct character and depth of the game world, that there's more to it going on than the surface that we see even playing the game. If we look at what this means in terms of the game world, we now know the Lord of the Underworld must have created it in order to protect this Chamber of Bone that has a great treasure hidden within it. It also raises more unanswered questions because were these monsters summoned to defend it, or were they treasure hunters that died and are now bound to protect it? We don't know for sure, and that question is never answered, but again, it adds so much depth to a quest that could otherwise only be about getting more powerful equipment. When we continue venturing further down in the dungeon, our path may lead us to another quest with a chance of not appearing, but it has a special significance and might be one of my personal favorites in this entire game, out of many that are already great. Close to the end of the dungeon, after defeating large amounts of all of these demonic knights, there's one that we're unable to attack. However, if we hover the mouse over it, it's Lochdonnen, captain of King Leoric's forces and champion of light. Speaking to him reveals the following.
Please, don't kill me. Just hear me out. I was once captain of King Leoric's knights, upholding the laws of this land with justice and honor. Then his dark curse fell upon us for the role we played in his tragic death. As my fellow knights succumbed to their twisted fate, I fled from the king's burial chamber, searching for some way to free myself from the curse. I failed. I have heard of a golden elixir that could lift the curse and allow my soul to rest, but I have been unable to find it. My strength now wanes, and with it, the last of my humanity as well. Please aid me and find the elixir. I will repay your efforts. I swear upon my honor.
This is amazing for several reasons. One is earlier in my playthrough, I came across two separate quests that allowed me to interact with demons in the dungeon. The first one was a character named Garbod the Weak. He begged us to not attack, and if we walk away and go back multiple times, each time the demon says it's working on an item for us, and on the final time it says the following.
This too good for you. Very powerful. You want, you take.
So ultimately, it betrays us. In another example, we see a character named Snotspill. It wants us to find some sort of a magic banner, else it will attack us. Once we go looking and find this banner, we can give it to the demon, but if we do so, this happens.
You give? Yes, good. Go now. We strong. We kill all with big magic.
The reason I point out both of these examples is because these are two separate times that we were able to interact with demons in the game, and ultimately they betrayed us. A precedent has been set with this to not trust any demon that we can interact with and to expect an ambush at any possible moment. Understandably, of course, many players wouldn't necessarily trust anything that Lockdown says down here, including myself when I first came across this quest all those years ago. An option we do have if we're suspicious is to head back to Tristram and see if the townsfolk have anything to say about what we've seen. We get the following dialogue if we speak first to Adria, then Griswold, the town blacksmith.
You may meet people who are trapped within the labyrinth, such as Lochdannen. I sense in him honor and great guilt. Aid him, and you aid all of Tristram.
If it is actually Lochdannen that you've met, then I would advise that you aid him. I dealt with him on several occasions and found him to be honest and loyal in nature. The curse that fell upon the followers of King Leoric would fall especially hard upon him.
Alright, so that's a really interesting lead up already, and if we want to continue getting more information, it comes as no surprise that the last person we speak with is Deckard Cain.
You claim to have spoken with Lochdannen? He was a great hero during his life. Lochdannen was an honourable and just man who served his king faithfully for years, while those who were caught within the grasp of the king's curse, Lochdannen would be the least likely to submit to the darkness without a fight. So I suppose that your story could be true. If I were in your place, my friend, I would find a way to release him from his torture.
This is so extraordinary because it removes all doubt that we might have had up to this point, and we now have all of this evidence from the characters urging us to help Lochdannen and release him from this curse. Going back down into the dungeon, we find the elixir and take it back to him. We then hear the following.
You have saved my soul from damnation, and for that, I am in your debt. If there is ever a way that I can repay you from beyond the grave, I will find it. But for now, take my helm. On the journey I'm about to take, I will have little use for it. May it protect you against the dark powers below. Go with the light, my friend.
Afterwards, I probably sat at my computer for about a minute or so as I just contemplated everything that went into making this quest the way that it was. I mean, I truly can't believe the way the developers, the writers, and the voice actors brought everything together that culminated in a moment that felt like this light against all of the darkness that's not only physically around the game world, but also the overall tone of the story as well. It was just beautiful. I think the craziest part to me is the fact that so much detail went into this quest and it's not even 100% guaranteed to be in a playthrough. The other quest that you might see doesn't quite reach up to the same height that this previous one did, but it does also still have some deep connections to the lore of the world, and it's called the Warlord of Blood. It begins when we read this steel tome.
The armories of hell are home to the Warlord of Blood. In his wake lay the mutilated bodies of thousands. Angels and men alike have been cut down to fulfill his endless sacrifices to the Dark Ones.
Well, the way they're leading it up makes it sound like it will for sure be a challenge, and that sense only grows if we head back to town and, as usual, ask Deckard Cain to give us some more information.
I know of only one legend that speaks of such a warrior as you describe. His story is found within the ancient chronicles of the Sin War. Stained by 1,000 years of war, blood, and death, it is also written that although he was once a mortal who fought beside the Legion of Darkness during the Sin War, he lost his humanity to his insatiable hunger for blood.
So this is fascinating because heading to fight this warrior, we know they used to be human, but have aligned themselves with demons and chaos. Over the course of 1,000 years of fighting in the Sin War, they became strong enough to defeat even angels. Once we get to the character and start the fight, it's probably the most difficult for the Sorcerer class. The reason being, the Warlord of Blood is immune to both lightning and fire, and all other damaging spells, so that's nice if you're playing this class. What are you supposed to do exactly when you're a Sorcerer? Well, you must pray that you found either or could afford to buy the one spell that actually does work, that being Stone Curse. After that, you turn the character to stone and proceed to poke the Warlord of Blood with the almighty wizard staff. If you were lucky enough to find a golem book along with the Stone Curse, then it definitely helps to end the fight much quicker. So we just saw an example of how using Stone Curse is definitely viable on a single opponent, but it does take quite a bit of mana, so what do you do when you face hordes of enemies that are extremely resistant to magic, if not outright immune? Well, many of these knights are immune to lightning and are highly resistant to fire, so luckily at this point I was able to buy an awesome spell book called Elemental that sends a running fire demon at them. Down here, we eventually find a pentagram on the floor and nearby the Staff of Lazarus, which is the character that betrayed the town. When we go back to Cain, he reveals a secret to us that shows why he's so knowledgeable and contains an incredible amount of wisdom.
This does not bode well, for it confirms my darkest fears. While I did not allow myself to believe the ancient legends, I cannot deny them now. Perhaps the time has come to reveal who I am. My true name is Deckard Cain the Elder, and I am the last descendant of an ancient brotherhood that was dedicated to safeguarding the secrets of a timeless evil, an evil that quite obviously has now been released. The Archbishop Lazarus, once King Leoric's most trusted advisor, led a party of simple townsfolk into the labyrinth to find the king's missing son, Albrecht. I should have suspected his veiled treachery then. It must have been Lazarus himself who kidnapped Albrecht and has since hidden him within the labyrinth.
So it turns out in a reveal that Cain is part of an ancient brotherhood that can be none other than the Herodrum we learned about previously from the manual. Everything with Lazarus is also starting to make a little bit more sense now with his betrayal, so we head back to the dungeon and find a red portal that is right around the pentagram and enter. What awaits us is long corridors, and this makes for one of the best use of the spells Flame Wave, because it's easily able to clear a large amount of enemies, so I used it to great effect here. After reading some tomes, we are able to make our way to transporters and see a cutscene. It takes us through the town of Tristram and the monastery where it lands on Lazarus. As a sign he's now completely corrupted, his eyes turn red and we hear the next dialogue.
Abandon your foolish quest. All that awaits you is the wrath of my master. You are too late to save the child. Now you will join him in hell.
We then get ambushed, but thanks to a fire elemental spell, which is awesome by the way, we're able to even the odds and then use that same spell to take down Lazarus himself. Of course, we can't ignore the fact that Lazarus seems to have committed murder down here, so we head back to town and speak to Cain and see what he has to say.
The boy that you describe is not our prince, but I believe that Albrecht may yet be in danger. The symbol of power that you speak of must be a portal in the very heart of the labyrinth. Know this, my friend. The evil that you move against is the Dark Lord of Terror. He is known to mortal men as Diablo. It was he who was imprisoned within the labyrinth many centuries ago.
He goes on to say that we must now face and ultimately defeat the Lord of Terror himself, Diablo. When we go back to the dungeon, the pentagram now glows red on the floor, and if we click on it, it takes us to the final level in the game. What ensues, at least as the mage, is casting hundreds of flame wave spells to try and clear the rooms, because it's a great spell that can actually hurt the demons, and it hits multiple enemies with a single cast. I mean, it's hard to say if I actually did do hundreds of the spell or not, but regardless, I knew that I needed to continuously stock up on mana potions because it is a lot. We activate some levers that are around, and we do make our way to Diablo, and the fight is definitely challenging, at least again as the sorcerer, because there's so many demons around, and Diablo is extremely resistant to all kinds of magic. In my first attempt, I didn't bring enough potions and I ran out of mana, so I got stuck down here and I didn't think to bring a town portal scroll to take me back to Tristram. The mage can normally cast it as a spell if you found it as a book earlier in the game, but without mana, that's not possible, so I end up getting killed. On my next attempt, I'm fully stocked with mana potions and ready to go, so I'm able to get Diablo stuck this time in a massive amount of firewalls, and then use that elemental spell over and over and over. And I ask, what really is a more fitting way than to defeat the Lord of Terror, the ultimate fire user, than with an abundance of fire? In the final cutscene, the main hero takes Diablo's soul stone, and when the demon's body fades, we discover it was Prince Albrecht that was possessed. In a now famous turn of events, the hero plunges Diablo's soul stone into their head, and we hear the final dialogue.
The soul stone burns with hellfire as an eerie red glow blurs your vision. Fresh blood flows into your eyes, and you begin to hear the tormented whispers of the damned. You have done what you knew must be done. The essence of Diablo is contained. For now. You pray that you have become strong enough to contain the demon and keep him at bay. Although you have been fortified by your quest, you can still feel him, clawing his way up from the dark recesses of your soul. Fighting to retain control, your thoughts turn toward the ancient mystic lands of the Far East. Perhaps there, beyond the desolate wastes of Aranok, you will find an answer. Or perhaps salvation.
While needless to say, it's an iconic end to a game, and it's no wonder why so many people consider Diablo a brilliant masterpiece, myself included. So why didn't it end here, and instead there was a Hellfire expansion? Well, to learn why, we need to dive into some interesting things that happened behind the scenes after Diablo was put out in the world. Blizzard, along with Blizzard North, was previously owned by a company called Davidson and Associates. However, Davidson was then acquired by CompuCard International, or CUC for short. CUC also purchased Sierra Online at this time, and that gave them access to a company called Synergistic Software. Executives in CUC saw how commercially successful Diablo was, and they wanted an expansion. Blizzard North was already working on a sequel, Diablo 2, at the time, and that is a natural continuation of the story, so they weren't interested in doing an expansion. From there, the executives decided to give the expansion to another developer in their fold that they had recently purchased, Synergistic Software. They had just completed Birthright: The Gorgon's Alliance, a game that combined both RTS and RPG elements. It's interesting to note that some people at Blizzard during an interview didn't necessarily mind this too much, but others, understandably, definitely were not very thrilled about hearing this. So that meant a design document was sent to Synergistic about what exactly should be added in this expansion. It was also decided that all decisions about anything else being added had to be okayed by the team at Blizzard. At that time, it was also decided that the two companies would communicate for security reasons via CD-ROM by mailing each other. Any submission sent for approval by Synergistic and then a reply from Blizzard would have to be done in this way. During development, the team at Synergistic ended up being ahead of schedule, and given that CDs were being physically mailed, they had plenty of downtime and decided at one point to try and add things into Hellfire that weren't on the design document and also weren't officially approved yet by Blizzard. These things that were added are considered unofficial and hidden as Easter eggs. So to begin though, why don't we first look at the things that are considered to be official in the game and go from there. That begins with the manual. The story section places the events of the expansion as happening at the same time as Diablo begins rising in power. It describes someone called a dark mage that is seen around the cemetery in Tristram multiple times. One evening, smoke and a red glow appeared, but people soon forgot as King Leoric grew more and more mad. There's also now a piece of land that appears as a dome on a farmer's property, and it looks alien to the townsfolk. There's a little bit more detail here about what people saw and how they feel, but compared to the original manual, this doesn't necessarily add almost anything to the lore or the universe of this world. It's more that it's an interesting event that takes place in the town. When we start the game, there's an opening cinematic that shows this dark mage the manual referenced. I was surprised when I first saw it because it is well animated and it definitely tells us that strange creatures and a demon have all now been released. We can also see the tone is pretty different from the original game because the main antagonist, Diablo, only makes noises in the trailer, and I believe he doesn't actually say a word throughout the entire original game. Here we can already listen to some of the voice lines by the main character or demon called Nakruel, and I'll be honest, I'm kind of undecided how I feel about the direction they went with the voice they decided to give the character. Going into the game, there is a new class that's been added, and it's called the Monk. It has a unique playstyle because it excels with a staff-type weapon. It is a somewhat underutilized weapon because before it was only used by mages in order to cast spells or give some magical benefit. If the Monk uses one, however, it receives an attack and a speed bonus, and it excels at blocking when equipped with one of these staffs. They also can hit multiple targets in a single attack depending on how the monsters are lined up. When it comes to the kind of armor the Monk wants to wear, it is the light armor specifically because they do receive a defense bonus from this. It's interesting because they're incentivized to wear only medium or heavy armor if the stats are exceptional. They also were given a unique ability called Search, and that highlights items on the ground when it's used, and it doesn't cost any mana for them to do that, so it's a great quality of life feature to help find things. Speaking of quality of life, if we go to another improvement, you'll immediately notice something is pretty different compared to when we played the original Diablo, and that is the character move speed. You can tell it looks like we're running across the town in terms of speed, but we are still using that walking animation. It does only apply in the town of Tristram, but it is super convenient to have. Blizzard North was trying to develop a new animation for the run speed at the time of creating Diablo, but they ended up running out of time before the original game shipped. The Synergistic developers discovered if they simply skipped every other walking frame or animation, then the character looked more natural when they were moving faster, and they didn't have to develop an entire new animation for each class. I'll be honest in that I never did really have a huge issue with the walking speed in the original game. I think it's because as you're walking slow, you actually start to notice some of the details of the town and the way that it feels and all of the various look of the characters, so somehow it almost builds a deeper connection compared to when you're running quickly, but it is still super convenient to be able to run fast if you want to. Another thing that's been added are elemental runes, and you can place them on the floor of the dungeon for enemies to walk on. They also included different oils to the game that can be either applied to weapons or armor, and in this case we found some that increase either the hit chance or a small increase to damage to a weapon. An amazingly welcome addition is we can now choose 2 higher difficulty levels in the single player campaign. This is great because of course it increases the replayability of the game even further beyond what it already was before. One of my personal favorite new additions have to be a handful of new spells. even though some of them are only twists on the original spells, but still, we do get a handful of new ones, and I appreciate it nonetheless. One of them, for example, is called Berserk, and it turns enemies to your side for a brief period of time. Another spell is called Immolation, which you cast fireballs around yourself in every direction, and it looks absolutely awesome. Another one is called Lightning Wall, which you probably already guess is only replacing Firewall with lightning. And by the way, if you didn't think it was already difficult enough to try and avoid hurting yourself when you cast your own firewall, because when you walk over it in the original game, it does hurt you too, you can cast a literal ring of fire around yourself for those times that you ever felt like being either trapped or claustrophobic. It's worth mentioning that all of this is integrated into the original dungeon in Diablo as well. Let's move on and now look at the story and the quests when it comes to Hellfire. It is introduced a little over halfway through the adventure of the original game. You're able to access it with a new character in town called Lester the Farmer. You have to reach either the 9th floor or a character level of 15 and he'll offer you a quest. He wants to use a bomb to destroy a thing that has appeared on his field. This is also where, for the first time in all of these years playing Diablo, I clicked on the cows over and over and over for no reason other than I was curious to hear their sound effects and their voice lines, and I had no idea that this clip existed in the game.
Yes, that is a cow, all right.
If we move on to the growth just outside of the town, we have to take that bomb out of our inventory, and this is a new and creative way for us to perform an action that we haven't done before. We have to drop the item on a specific area and it explodes to reveal a new dungeon. We're met with an interesting sounding voice line when we go inside.
We have long lain dormant, and the time to awaken has come. After our long sleep, we are filled with great hunger. Soon now we shall feed.
There's something about this that reminds me of the opening cinematic and how I'm not sure how I feel about the way they decided to go with the voice line and the tone that it's read in. Instead of this fitting the way the rest of the game and the quests and the characters all sound, it kind of reminds me more of the character Rita Repulsa from Power Rangers, for anyone familiar with that.
Soon now we shall feed.
Sleep well then, or I shall have my revenge upon you and the rest of the world.
The dungeon itself contains 4 levels, and both it and the monsters inside are themed mostly around bugs, with a few types of demons that are mixed in here and there. The bugs are creative, and I definitely give them credit for trying something different and unique, but I would say that it feels somewhat out of place to me compared to everything else in Tristram because it's all about demons. And I understand they want to try and add something new in, most likely, but I think that because we're in the same area of Tristram, trying to change some of the things that happens doesn't necessarily feel right to me. Not that it's a bad thing, it just feels slightly off. That being said, some of the demons they added are definitely great, such as these little ones that jump around. They always make me laugh when I see them. I would say also with the aesthetic of the level, I'm not a huge fan of the way that the dungeon itself looks. It's by no means bad at all, it's just that my preference would be probably instead of bugs and all the green and the goo, maybe if they explored another extreme element, like maybe ice or even more lava than we've seen before and have corresponding monsters that fit, that would have been great. If we move lower into the dungeon, it reveals yet some more dialogue.
These lands shall be defiled, and our brood shall overrun the field.
The time has finally come. Gather round. I have the perfect plan to conquer that pathetic little planet Earth.
Yeah, so now I would say it's definitely getting to be a little bit more on the silly side. When we eventually meet the boss, it looks like it's a rather large centipede, and the timing of the voice line they say when I come across it, and the way the fight unfolds, honestly couldn't be any better.
Come closer, morsel. I smell your terror.
We do receive a map from this creature, and if we open it, we see where we need to go next and drop this item. Now, this is a great and interesting way of showing us how to proceed that is completely different from what we've seen in the base game, and I appreciate they tried to change the way that the quest unfolds. We move to the graveyard and drop the map on this newly added tombstone to reveal the second dungeon in this expansion. Right away, it feels more in line, to me at least, with the original game. The dungeon's environment draws inspiration from Diablo, and 100% that is a positive thing to me. The monsters here also fall in line with the rest of the game. A couple of the top picks, however, are the goat demons that now appear with scythes and wings. Another one are these large stone gargoyle creatures. They have an incredibly satisfying animation when they're defeated and crumble. Moving further into the dungeon, we venture upon a tome, and they were able to get the original voice actor for this that read all of the story in the game, and I'm glad they did that because he does a tremendous job reading these lines.
My home is slowly becoming corrupted by the vileness of this unwanted prisoner. The crypts are full of shadows that move just beyond the corners of my vision. The faint scrabble of claws dances at the edges of my hearing. They are searching, I think, for this journal.
There's also this special area that's located on the first level of the dungeon. Now, it's tucked away and it's in its own room, and it's called the Cornerstone of the World. If we toss an item on the ground, we hear some lore of the Diablo universe.
And in the year of the golden light, it was so decreed that a great cathedral be raised. The cornerstone of this holy place was to be carved from the translucent stone Antirial, named for the angel who shared his power with the Horadrim.
It goes on to tell that in the year of the drawing shadows, the great cathedral fell, and then later during the Sin War, humans used these stones for their own works. In practical terms, it means you can trade items with yourself during single-player campaigns. An item dropped here will be able to be gathered on another one of your characters. I really appreciate the extra effort they put into incorporating this new mechanic by making this stone have special significance to the lore. If we move further into the dungeon, we find yet another book that states the creature has howls of fury and rages against the one who sent it to the void. That's an interesting note that will come up again later. There's another tome right next to it that then says the following.
My time is quickly running out. I must record the ways to weaken the demon, and then conceal that text, lest his minions find some way to use my knowledge to free their lord.
It's an intriguing lead up to the demon, because when we get to that 4th floor and battle our way through a number of demons, there are 3 books and a lever on the ground that we discover. The tome was referring to reading these books in the correct order to be able to weaken Na'Krul before the fight. However, if we decide to not try and read them in the correct order and just pull that lever, we get a voice line you would not normally hear otherwise.
Out of my way, wretched human! Retribution calls for he whom you call Diablo!
This is an excellent way to tie this to the original game by making it Diablo that sent this demon Na'Krul to the void. Because of that, I decided to load the game before releasing him to see if anyone in Tristram had more information about this scenario or situation, and unfortunately, not a single person in the town has a voice line about this. Not even Deckard Cain has anything to say about this, which did feel strange considering he had so much information about everything else that we've seen. I definitely understand they weren't able to get any of the original voice actors back to read these lines, but it is too bad because that would have been an amazing way to add a tremendous amount of immersion. When I did go back to Na'Krul, this time I read the books in the correct order, and we do hear a somewhat anticlimactic line.
What? Who dares disturb the great Na'Krul? Your life is forfeit, mortal.
Overall, I do think this is a fine conclusion to the dungeon, and it doesn't hit the same high as some of the other quests we've explored, but I do believe at least it's an interesting side story. There is something else that I haven't really touched base on yet, and that would be immediately noticeable if you bought this back in the day. It is the lack of Battle.net connectivity. Battle.net is of course no doubt famous now for what it established in letting people play together online. I have tons of my own personal experiences of playing with some family members and friends, so many countless hours on there, that was amazing. I don't think it's an understatement to say that it's probably one of the biggest reasons why Diablo became so popular outside of the outstanding story. Now, although the chat is empty right now, I remember so many lively discussions here and people looking for groups. I used to love looking at people's profiles and, sure, of course you can see all sorts of crazy things that people might write in their description, but the ones that do stick out to me that I still remember even to this day were from people role-playing, and I always thought it was so awesome and fun to see when people would get so into the game world. The reason Hellfire doesn't have access to Battle.net is Blizzard didn't want the new Monk class or anything else that was being introduced to interfere with their online balancing that they tried so hard to get perfect. It makes sense because they weren't working on the game themselves, so they couldn't easily verify that. And back in the day, I would say that could be a huge issue depending upon how much you used Battle.net or not. Now would be a good time to look at everything that was added to Hellfire, but it's considered unofficial. And to access it, you have to go through an interesting step of editing a command.txt file, and then this unlocks the secret or the hidden items. There are a couple of hidden classes that can be accessed in this way, one of them being the Bard that holds a one-handed weapon in each hand. The other one is surprisingly the Barbarian class that can hold certain two-handed weapons in one hand and then a shield in the other. Both are only reskins of the Rogue and the Warrior, and then once Blizzard found out about this, of course they demanded that it be removed, especially the Barbarian, because it was being created for Diablo 2. Another secret is you can make the game playable online technically. Granted, it is only if computers are connected to the same network, and then there's also 2 hidden quests. One is tied to a new character, a little girl that asks us to find her teddy bear. Normally, I would say this doesn't seem to make any difference and it's not a big deal that they tried to add this in. But 100% in this case with the original tone of Diablo, this is bizarre and feels out of place for a world that was established up to this point. The second quest turns the new character Lester the Farmer into someone called the Complete Nut, and they are now dressed as a cow. He asks us to find some of his clothing, and it turns out it's only a brown cow suit. In an interview, the developers say this is a nod that back then there were rumors online of an elaborate way to activate a secret in Diablo that involved cows, but it didn't actually exist at that time. There's something about the tone with this that, again, kind of feels off to me, and even the humor doesn't seem like it fits with everything that we've seen before. And I get what they were trying, they're not trying to be serious about this, but I'm not sure that it's the right way to add something that they thought may have been funny back then. Now, to find out why I consider it in this way, let's look at an example from the main game of some of the humor that was added in, and we need to not look any further than the Black Mushroom quest. It starts when we find a book called The Fungal Tome within the dungeon of the original Diablo. Take it to Adria, and she says the following about a black mushroom.
Keep your eyes open for a black mushroom. It should be fairly large and easy to identify. If you find it, bring it to me, won't you?
Okay, great. So first, it's fairly large. That's good to know. And if we speak to Adria again, her explanation of the mushroom expands a bit.
It's a big black mushroom that I need. Now run off and get it for me so that I can use it for a special concoction that I am working on.
Huh, interesting. So now it's referred to as a large mushroom. Well, if we go and decide to ask Griswold the blacksmith about the quest, he has the following to say.
If Adria doesn't have one of these, you can bet that's a rare thing indeed. I can offer you no more help than that. But it sounds like a huge, gargantuan, swollen, bloated mushroom. Well, good hunting, I suppose.
It's silly because of course they're clearly escalating the mushroom every time a character references it, and when we eventually do go and find that mushroom patch in the dungeon and then click on it for the item to drop, we hear something as we do so.
Well,
Now that is a big mushroom.
Now, is this a silly quest? Yes, it definitely is, and I wouldn't blame anybody if they said they preferred it not be in the game at all for the original Diablo. For me, it still fits within the theme of the world because we're finding an item for a character to make a potion, and all of the characters surrounding this quest are commenting on it in a silly way. It's not something like a ridiculous item or a ridiculous outfit for a character that they're wearing. That being said, I could see other people feeling differently, so not a big deal. So with all of this said and done, at the end of the day, how is Hellfire? While I would for sure say it has a couple of missteps here and there, at least the quests and the dungeons are all optional. It does add some nice quality of life features to the game, along with a handful of those various new items and spells too, so that's nice to see. I did enjoy my time with Hellfire, and I would say to anyone else that was curious about it, it is worth experiencing for sure. Maybe not all of it unless you felt like it, but most of it is definitely. This isn't to mention anything about some of the mods that are out there too that can really enhance the game even further beyond what Hellfire did. Devolution X is one of those where I haven't had a lot of experience with that mod, but I know that a lot of the things added in Hellfire are expanded upon by the community in something like that modification. After having experienced both the original Diablo now many times and also Hellfire being added to that, the original Diablo is still so incredible and iconic. I truly love it so much, and I could go back even now and replay it. If you have a craving for the original game, I would say check out what else is out there to at least see if you're interested, and if not, that's no big deal. Just go with the original, you'll still love it all these years later. Now we go to something that is the final portion of the video, because anyone that has seen some of my previous videos, you might know that I really love and enjoy using and discussing a game's strategy guide. If we take a look at the guide for Diablo, it for sure has some high quality to it. They added plenty of screenshots throughout, which is always nice because you know then exactly what is being discussed and you can see it on the screen of the game too. One of my personal favorite things though, as a child, was to look at all of the artwork similar to the manual that you can see scattered throughout some of the pages. I always have loved looking at those. So other than that, about 95% or more of this guide is focused on how you do things in the game, describing things like how the characters work and how the monsters are, how you can combat them, and all of the equipment that you find. There's also pages upon pages of statistics for all of these things that I just mentioned. Because of the random nature of the levels, they didn't include any maps because it wasn't necessarily possible to show that. And of course that makes sense. The quest section does briefly explain some different tactics you can take and what you need to do in order to complete them. It also points out monster resistances, which is nice and great if you didn't know that, especially at the time frame that this book was released. However, it would have been great if they included maps here for the quests that are always in the game and the maps don't change. It's not many, but it's the Chamber of Bone, that's one. Lazarus is another that is always there, and then same with the final dungeon level of 16 with Diablo. That does not change either. They did include at the back of the book an interview with the developers, and I always love when they have that in there. I didn't used to read that when I was younger, but now I really appreciate it because it's insightful, and I enjoy reading and seeing what the people that created the game have to say about it and different things they encountered. So I do admit I love this guide because it's been with me for so many years, but in terms of being necessarily helpful to the game, I don't think it's incredibly helpful, not considering everything that we can look up online right now. But for anyone that's interested, there is a free online version if you look it up, which is always great if you just feel like taking a look at it at some point. Well, that pretty much covers everything for this specific video, but if there's a game that you would like to see discussed, please let me know down below in the comments. I go through and read every single one, and I really appreciate all of the suggestions because it helps guide the channel as I continue to learn throughout this process. If you made it and watched all the way to the end at this point, thank you so much for joining and being here. That also means so much to me. I really appreciate it. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, wherever you are in the world.